Welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian, joined as always by our producer, Justin Stein. And today we've got Alex Vigderman and James Weber on from the football research team at SIS. James, you wrote this week on the 33rdteam.com about the red zone performances of each of the teams playing in this weekend's divisional round games. Let's start off there. What did you write about there? What were some of the high-level notes you had from that? And then we'll kind of use that as a jumping-off point to go around the league and discuss all these different games.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we move further into the playoffs, obviously the teams that are remaining are definitely considered one of the highest-powered offenses that are in there. So when it comes to scoring and converting opportunities, obviously there's no bigger magnification than in the red zone. So I wanted to take a look at which teams are surging in the red zone and converting on those chances to score touchdowns, and some that are surprisingly struggling to do so, which might bite them later on in the playoffs. Might be this weekend, might be further along. But yeah, just a quick glimpse of the rankings here. We have the Cowboys as the highest rated red zone team based on EPA per play left in the playoffs. And then the worst team, which may come to a surprise to a lot of you, is the Bills.
Yeah, that is interesting. It's also interesting because sometimes the red zone performance can kind of work in the opposite direction. I think that's a good maybe transition to segue Alex and welcome him to the show. Sometimes that red zone performance isn't as sustainable as a lot of other things.
Yeah, not as sustainable. We'll see as we sort of talk through these games that typically good offenses are good generally, but in these kind of funky slices, a couple of weird plays that happen over the course of the season can really dramatically affect both game outcomes and measures of outcomes like expected points added. It's worth noting that on that list, so you could think like, oh, the Bills are the worst of the playoff teams, but they might be like 12th out, in the entire league. No, they're 28th. Like this is legitimately bad in the red zone, not just like bad among very good offenses.
All right, we'll get back to the Bills in a little bit. So let's do these games chronologically, though. Let's work our way through the weekend. I personally tend to think that the Saturday games should be less competitive than the Sunday games based on what I would expect, not just on paper, but all year long, really. It's been a feeling like there are these, not all year long, but for at least the second half of the season, there have been 6 real contenders, and then there's been kind of everybody else. And I still think we have those 6 real contenders alive, the 2 home teams on Saturday, and then the 4 teams competing on Sunday. But let's start off because the Jaguars have been a bit of a favorite of total points throughout the year. Early in the year, they were losing some close games, but total points still seemed to think the underlying team was very good. It ended up being proven right when the Jaguars made the playoffs. Last week's game was obviously a tale of 2 halves when it came to them beating the Chargers, and Joe Lombardi shockingly was fired after that game. But this week they've got the Chiefs, and I would say that the Chiefs to me are the favorite, period, end of discussion when it comes to these final 8 teams that are competing for the Super Bowl. What does the red zone performance have to say about this matchup? What can we learn from that list in terms of what we can expect from the Jaguars and the Chiefs, James?
Yeah, so on our list here, the Chiefs come in as the 3rd highest rated red zone offense, and the Jaguars fall down a little bit. They're down below 10 there at 13th. So they come in as our 3rd worst offensive performance in the red zone. So it'll certainly be interesting to see how often, they get into situations of 4th and medium, 4th and long, where they have to convert those chances to obviously knock off the Chiefs, see if Doug Peterson will roll with those punches and go for gaining the first down rather than kicking field goals.
Yeah, the Peterson thing is part of this whole red zone. Being good in the red zone is very much about making those key decisions on late downs, because not only are you getting 3rd and 4th down plays that are generally high leverage, but now you're in close, and the decision to go for it or not is the difference between scoring and not, and really losing a very obvious scoring opportunity if you are turning the ball over in the red zone. So yeah, those decisions that work out for him a lot of the time, if he makes a couple of those calls in this game and they don't work out, the narrative sort of flips very quickly.
Well, yeah, and I'll point out, so think about the Tyler Huntley play from last week. That is a 1 foot line. You have 6 expected points going into the play, and it ends up going back all the way in the other direction. That's obviously going to be a huge EPA swing for your red zone performance there. So I would say there's probably 2 things. Number one is don't turn it over, because then you get 0 points or actually negative points out of your red zone trip. And then the second thing is to what you were saying before about being aggressive, 7 is more than twice as much as 3. So that's why it rewards being aggressive. That's why it's helpful to be aggressive in those situations. Sometimes math is like really stupid. Like it took NBA teams years and years and years to realize that 3 is 50% more than 2. And therefore a 33% shooting 3-point team is as good as a 50% shooting 2-point team. I think this is another case where it's just like for years and years and years, we didn't realize that 7 was more than twice as much as 3. So being aggressive in the red zone, smart.
I think that is part of it. I also think that one of the flaws in the way that people think about fourth down decision making in the middle of the field is like, yeah, you can convert that fourth down, but you still have like 50 yards to go to score a touchdown from that point. So like part of the idea of pushing those edges is to be able to give yourself an opportunity to score, but you still have many yards left to gain. Whereas in the red zone, a lot of those conversions on fourth down are touchdowns immediately, right? Like we're not assuming that you're gaining if you have 4th and 4 on the 6-yard line, like a lot of those fourth down conversions are touchdowns immediately, right? You get those extra 2 yards. And so it's just like the conversions you get are basically like locking in points, whereas the conversions you get in the middle of the field are not necessarily doing.
So the flaw in the way that I think about this is, I think, sort of the opposite side of the same coin. The thing that always surprises me is how much the models like going for it on your own side of the field, because it's so intuitive to me that the model would like it when you're getting closer to score for the exact reason that you said. The part that's less intuitive to me is like the models know that those yards around midfield are easier to get. And so that kind of sways their decision the model's recommendation to be aggressive, because they're like, oh no, if you get this, you can really easily get into field goal range. And from there, we're talking gravy train. It still always surprises me though, like the thought of going for it on your own 20 early in a game. It's like, well, even if I get this first down, I still got to go another 75 yards. Like, what am I doing here?
Yeah, well, in general, we're not going to be, if you're on your own 20, it's basically going to be those like 4th and 1s that are much more than a coin flip. But yeah, I mean, that what you're saying is basically, and actually what we were just talking about in those 2 examples is basically the 2 halves of that calculation. It's the odds of converting versus the value if you do convert, right? And so in the middle of the field, it's easier to get 6 yards. And so you can be more aggressive in the middle of the field because you're more likely to succeed. Not necessarily because the value is a lot higher, but in the red zone, the field is compressed. It's harder to get 6 yards, but the value is you have a basically guaranteed touchdown or something very close to that.
All right. Back from nerding out a little bit to the game here. On paper, I think that this could be sort of a similar game script to last week. I think the Chiefs would like it if they got way out in front the way that the Chargers did. I have a hard time seeing the Jaguars have some nice players on defense, some young players that I think are stepping up really well. It's just hard for me to see how they can really stop Patrick Mahomes, given everything that we've seen out of that offense this year. And then, the Chiefs seem to always get into these games where it's like, we're going to get ahead and then we're going to do just enough to hold them off and make you nervous. I think that could be kind of the way that this one goes, just probably with a better result for the Chiefs than it ended with the Chargers.
I mean, the Jaguars have shown a repertoire here of being able to do that and coming back in that second half. If the Chiefs play with their food a little bit coming in the second half, you look at the Ravens game, the Jaguars had, the Cowboys game, and obviously last week against the Chargers. And even in that first matchup against the Chiefs, the Jaguars came back and really pushed that into a one-possession game. So, I mean, the Chiefs are shown to be vulnerable when blowing second half leads. So that'll be certainly something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, one thing I found in doing just like a little bit of research on the game is it'll be one of the places that Trevor Lawrence really improved this year is against man coverage. And part of that is just like having better skill position players. But even in the way that Total Points evaluates him, which of course strips out some of the performance of the players after the catch and that sort of thing, he was 5th worst last season against man coverage. And this year he's 1st. And the Chiefs are a pretty heavy man coverage team, and they're one of the top 10 teams in terms of efficiency as well. So those and those matchups are going to be pretty interesting to see if Christian Kirk can really be a difference maker in his first year in Jacksonville.
He's been, I think, much better than certainly I gave him credit for going into the year, and they've got an interesting little group of skill players there around Trevor Lawrence. Okay, so it sounds like we're all kind of like see this game a little bit similarly. I think it becomes really difficult to see the Jaguars being able to follow that same script that they've been following throughout the year. but I think you make some good points there, James, about how it could go in that direction. Let's flip it forward to the night game, Giants versus Eagles. I tend to think this one's even less competitive. I would have a hard time picturing the Eli Manning Giants finding their way into a miracle run this year. I think this is it for them. But tell me about what the red zone has to say first, James.
Yeah, well, you might want to take some of that back on the confidence level. The Giants are the second best team in the red zone this year. So if they can actually get into the red zone, and I'm sure Alex can talk about if the Eagles will allow them to do that, the Giants have shown success. And that's been basically having their two-headed monster in the backfield running the ball, both Danny Jones and Saquon. The Giants are fifth in EPA per rush and fourth in rushing touchdowns in the red zone. And they're both Danny Jones and Saquon are top 10 as a quarterback and running back in positive run rate. And that's really opened up kind of their play action stuff as well. And that's kind of, over the course of their general offense in general, that's how they find their success. The Giants are tied for 11th in play action pass attempts in the red zone. And Danny's been second in both passing EPA and IQR when passing from play action in the red zone. So there's certainly opportunities they might have if Danny can find a way to play like he did last week. I don't see many defenses that can beat him. So we'll see.
What I will say is that the matchup against the Vikings, we knew ahead of time was going to be like whoever came out of that game was going to look better than they should have, because both of those teams were like the quote frauds in the NFC playoff pool, right? In terms of like total points per play, the Vikings were middle of the pack, sort of just outside the playoff range in terms of the league, but their record was much better than that. The Giants were 29th, I think, in terms of total points per. So like the Giants are a different kind of quote fraud in that sense, but their performance recently after that real swoon toward, leading into the end of the season, Daniel Jones had arguably his best game of his career last week. And so
total points believe so.
Yeah.
I saw Corey March tweeted that. Yeah.
Yes. And so, Nick Foles exists and Joe Flacco exists as players who not just in a, like there are flukes that look like flukes. And then there are flukes that you discover are flukes later on, but legitimately look excellent at the time. Like Foles, the performance that he had at the time was incredible in terms of like pinpoint accuracy, throwing downfield and that sort of thing, and less of like what he did in 2013, where he was like chucking it downfield and Riley Cooper was like, people were falling over and all kinds of weird stuff was happening that year. So like there's sort of two different kinds of flukes. And so it is possible that Daniel Jones could have a swing of excellent performance in the span of a few weeks and they make a run to the Super Bowl. It's just that they're coming from they're coming from behind in terms of just like the talent and the quality of the team compared to the teams they're going to be playing. So
I don't want to nitpick the types of flukes that exist. Just like, we nitpick the type of fraud that exists. So now we can do the type of flukes that exist. I think that the Giants are still very fraudulent, even though they took out a different fraud. And comparing Joe Flacco to Nick Foles is a little bit off to me, just because Flacco at least was a competent quarterback for 10 years, if he wasn't ever elite. But he was kind of a good enough player that you could have seen his upswing leading to a kind of win-with level Super Bowl quarterback. Foles, it doesn't make sense. Like, it still doesn't make sense. It still counts. So good for you and go Birds, all that stuff. But that was a real fluke. And I think that's what this would be if Danny Dimes continued to have what he did last week to keep going forward. I mean, the one thing I will say is, going all the way back to the red zone stuff, the Giants team is actually built to be a good red zone team. They're not built to be a very good lots of type of team. They're not a very good roster overall. They were really cleaning up a lot of stuff this year. I don't think they expected Daniel Jones to make their decision as hard as he might make it going into this offseason, although he might have played himself into a deal that makes them totally uninterested in re-signing him, depending on how much he rose his own value. But at the end of the day, I think that the Eagles are really good. Remember what happened the last time these two teams played? It wasn't particularly close. And while the Giants could be that good red zone team and could be designed to create some problems for certain types of teams, I don't think that type of team is this year's Eagles, because how do they stop the Eagles? When the Eagles have the ball, they're a better run team and a better pass team than the Giants are. And the Giants defense isn't special outside of a couple of players, your Dexter Lawrence's and a couple of pieces there.
The one thing that is unmeasurable and that we were just sort of guessing on is what the state of Jalen Hurts and the Eagles offense and sort of how they're feeling, because there was another
and Lane
game
Johnson.
The Eagles did play the Giants the second time this year. They destroyed them the first time, but the second time they played at the end of the season, Hurts was coming back off the injury. They were playing very vanilla, and he was playing very tentatively. He was not pushing. He would drop down instead of trying to get a first down when scrambling and stuff like that. But that game was a lot closer than you'd expect because the Giants were sitting everybody. And so I don't want to use that as like a basis for how close the game will be, but it does sort of illustrate that like the quality of the Eagles that you can expect is very much up in the air.
Yeah. It's amazing how the Giants were able to sit everybody in that game, and poor Mike Williams.
I feel like we have a Penn State alum on the show, so I feel like we have to talk about running backs in this matchup with Saquon and Miles Sanders. James, what's your take on these two guys in the backfield?
Yeah, I mean, they'll both probably tear it up. I mean, per usual. No, well, yeah, it'll definitely it'll be a challenge for both. In neither of the matchups, I think I saw somewhere that neither Dexter Lawrence or Leonard Williams played against the Eagles this year. So that'll be interesting to see if they can plug up Sanders in the backfield. But yeah, if Jalen's not 100%, you see them trying to get the ball to Sanders more to do more of his thing than taking some of that load off Jalen on his runs and things of that nature. And then, yeah, I mean, Saquon is just a beast. We'll see how he fares against a very solid Eagles run D.
Much more solid Eagles run D than it was, right? If we're talking about the Giants not having their big guys up the middle in the Eagles against the Eagles in previous games this year, and the Eagles having added guys, like this is potentially a very different look.
And they weren't even on the Eagles roster at the beginning of the season.
Exactly. Yeah, both Barkley and Sanders have been really good in terms of just like producing when in unfortunate circumstances when they get contacted at the line. Sanders has like 30. He led the NFL in broken and missed tackles per attempt when he gets hit behind the line. And Barkley, after last year, where he was not able to get those big plays in those situations for a Giants team that has not blocked for him particularly well, he was a lot better in terms of getting yards when he's hit behind the line and breaking tackles and stuff this year.
So one thing I will point out about the differences with the defensive tackles, the Eagles signed a few guys. The Eagles signed a few guys. They got some mercenaries off the street to stop the run. Whereas the Giants defensive tackles are, maybe outside of Thibodeau, the best players on their defense. And they're actually more impactful in the pass game than they've been in the run game, at least when you look at it this year. I don't think the Giants have enough team speed. You got to rely on Jalen Smith, stuff like that, to be able to run there. I don't think they have enough team speed if they're trying to hang with the Eagles run game. But I think as it pertains to the pass game, I think those guys could be impactful in terms of their ability to sort of upset the pocket, especially with a height deficient quarterback.
Yeah. And actually another thing that I found when looking at stuff for this game is that Jalen Hurts is surprisingly ineffective when throwing on the move. And Jones actually improved a lot in this respect. He was one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL throwing on the move this year. Whereas Hurts, oftentimes he's not pushing the envelope. He's, throwing it away or scrambling off of that. So it's a little bit about sort of his style of play when he's forced out of the pocket. But that is one aspect where Hurts's athleticism doesn't really help him. He's not really using those throws on the move to push the ball downfield, at least not as successfully.
I think that's part of the reason why he's able to be more accurate now than he was. When he pulls it down to run, right? Like he doesn't extend plays to throw. He extends plays to go get 5 yards and get to the next play, which it's been a great fit for them. They've been able to do with him there. All right. Now I'll definitely be wrong about both those games. The Jaguars and the Giants will probably win because I express such confidence, and the football gods frown upon that. But let's go to Sunday, where I think the matchups are really, really legit. The Bengals and the Bills are not playing in a neutral field. That'll be at 3:00 on Sunday. On paper, this is probably the matchup of the weekend. What can you tell us about the red zone performances of these teams? I know you surprised us earlier by saying that the Bills actually struggle down there.
Yeah, so in taking a look at this game, I was taking a look at the lines and saw that the total dipped down from 50.5 to 48.5. Now, I do know that there's some expected weather to come in, so that might be altering it, but also seeing a couple things on both offenses. First being so with the Bengals, obviously with the offensive line being hurt, with Jonah Williams going down and having some other gaps to fill there as well. It might be a little troublesome for Joe to get the ball off if he's dealing with immense pressure. I do know he's obviously one of the better quarterbacks in terms of snap to throw time. So it'll be a cat and mouse game there to see how fast they can get the ball away. But then also on the other side with the Bills, it's been very surprising to see them kind of struggle in this area of the field. And I think that has to do a lot with, Matt, what you mentioned earlier about turnovers. Josh Allen's thrown 6 interceptions in the red zone this year, which is double that of the next closest players in Mahomes and Trevor Lawrence. Obviously, turnovers are a major swing in red zone EPA results. So when you have turnovers that happen that often, it's kind of not a huge shock that Bills are this low down the list. And also, too, Allen's only 19th in on-target percentage and tied for 26th in completion percentage among 38 quarterbacks with 20 attempts in the red zone. So it's not even he's just not turning the ball over. He's also not very accurate either. And that's kind of been a trend that's been going. And we'll see if Lou Anarumo can dial something up with the Bengals defense to maybe force a turnover or two in that red zone and really clamp down and make him kick 3 instead of 7. Because obviously that's what's going to win these playoff games, in my opinion.
Yeah, we saw in the game last week with the Bills that Allen was trusting his arm quite a bit and potentially more than you'd want him to, pushing the ball downfield when a check down would have been totally fine. In the red zone, that manifests itself as making a throw when you might not need to, and taking a throw away instead of trying to push it into double coverage in the back of the end zone, that sort of thing. And Allen has shown a tendency to do that, to trust his arm. And he had accuracy issues coming into the league and whatever. That's not like 100% a solved thing. He does have these bouts of inaccuracy, but also he has bouts of over trusting his arm talent.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because in one sense, this is the Bills team that's been a Super Bowl favorite since the beginning of the year. They still are every bit that. All they've done is win a whole bunch of games. Obviously, they've been through it emotionally over the course of the last month or so. But we're talking about a team that's played really well. Like you look at the defensive line, how they've come along, where Ed Oliver's at in his development. Matt Milano just keeps making play after play after play. I keep thinking it's unsustainable and he's going to come back down to earth, but he just keeps making plays. Like this team is pretty awesome. Steph Diggs has been basically unguardable. Now, I think last week the Bills did get lucky. The Dolphins did so much stupid stuff and couldn't capitalize at all on the mistakes that were being made. When the Dolphins were doing their cover zero, let's be super aggressive thing, it was just like, okay, we'll throw it over your head to Steph Diggs. And then when the Dolphins actually backed off and started playing some defense that involved defensive backs in coverage, they got a couple of interceptions and some turnovers there kind of right into their lap. So this was playing with fire for the Bills. And if they do that again this week, then it's going to be even more of the same because this Bengals defense is legit. Like this is not the same Bengals that we saw last year. This team is really good defensively. Their front four is outstanding the way they performed this year. And they are, I think, are much more well-rounded than they were last year, even when they beat the Chiefs on their way to the Super Bowl. So this one I get concerned about because I think when the Bills have the ball, they're going to keep coming back to this idea of, okay, we should try to run it because that's how we're going to make Josh Allen play a little bit more protective style of football. But in actuality, they're going to be competing with Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and all this kind of stuff. They're going to need to put points on the board. They're going to feel pressured to put the ball into Josh Allen's hands. And I think when the ball's in Josh Allen's hands, two things happen: a lot of points and a lot of turnovers. So it could be a dangerous sort of scenario for them. Again, assuming that they're not going to just turn it back on and return to the team that we all thought they could be.
And going back to the question about the Bengals offensive line, the Jonah Williams injury isn't as big of a deal just in terms of the way that he's been playing, but it's more of just like putting guys who have really not been on the field in a playoff matchup. And the Bills pass rush is not as fearsome as it might have been if Von Miller was on the field, but they still have some guys, and they also have coverage on the back end where it's not as much about getting that quick rush as it is about if the play extends long enough, that coverage can hold up, and then that's where the pass rush becomes a problem. So if the Bengals can scheme some things up and get the ball out quickly and not really have to worry about some of that, I think that's really a route to victory.
Yeah, I think the Bengals learned earlier in this year that this 5 out on every route, get it all out, and we're going to quick drop you to death is actually unsustainable for them. Same reasons I was saying the Josh Allen stuff becomes unsustainable. They're actually at their best, I think, when they really lean into balance, even if it doesn't maximize their EPA on every single play. So for me, when you're talking about the backup offensive line, we've got backups in for guys who weren't even that good to begin with. To me, that means play it even safer. make sure that you manage Ed Oliver and Greg Rousseau by making them play run defense. But certainly dropping back and throwing it to Jamar Chase is not a bad strategy either. That'll be really fun. I'm really looking forward to that game, 3 p.m. on Sunday. Thank goodness it's not the Bucs. Corey March was right about one thing. I think I scared him out of the playoffs by just saying how many times I was fearing his appearance here. But Brady is out. The Cowboys are in, which I think is good because I think they are a much better team. And this, I think, is a bit of an underrated matchup, the way that I hear people talking about it. I think that the Cowboys, even though recent performance be damned, have an advantage at the quarterback position in this matchup. And I think that's something that we should not sleep on. So, James, tell us, what can we expect from a red zone perspective when the Cowboys visit the 49ers?
Yeah, and I think this is the game of the weekend by far. I know Bills-Bengals has its intrigue and everything, but I think this one, just the teams that are at stake, both teams with two of the most complete teams in the NFL, I think. I think this is going to be really exciting, really fun to watch. So yeah, as we hinted at earlier, the Cowboys are the best team in the red zone, and they've done it both ways. Dak Prescott, by far the best quarterback in the red zone, being first in our SIS IQR rating. He also boasts the third highest on target percentage and the highest completion percentage. So he's both accurate and getting the job done. And then, pair that with Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott, who are the best backfield when it comes to red zone offense. Elliott ranks third in touchdowns and fifth in positive run rate among running backs in the red zone, and Tony Pollard is still in the top 20. So they're able to do it any way they want to, and it's been very successful for them.
Yeah, I think it's easy and correct to love Tony Pollard in a lot of ways. It's also not as sexy, even though he's got the name recognition, to probably complement the things that Ezekiel Elliott brings to the table that are a little bit different. Ranking that highly in positive run rate in the red zone, that means you're sort of staying ahead of the chains in red zone situations. That's really, really important when it comes to being able to put touchdowns on the board. And I think that's a huge part of what gives them that sort of red zone balance. Both those guys, obviously hugely impactful in there. And then it sort of becomes a question, I think, of like, which Dak do you get there?
That was my takeaway, because we just talked about Josh Allen and throwing picks in the red zone, and Dak has had his issues with interceptions in other parts of the field this year, but not as much in the red zone. And if those were balanced a little bit differently, that could end up really bad for the Cowboys. And so it's very possible that he runs into an interception in the red zone that really changes the direction of the game. But so far this year, he's been nails. And that's going to be a big deal, because Brock Purdy on the 49ers side is not going to make a lot of mistakes. He's going to play within the confines of the offense. And I don't think he's really been that much better than Jimmy Garoppolo. If you look at his entire stat line, their stat lines are virtually identical in terms of accuracy and throw depth and taking sacks and that sort of thing. It's just that Purdy has been better he's been better on third and fourth down. He's been really good in the red zone, actually, which I'm sure James has some notes on. And that's really been the difference, is that he's just been really good in those key spots.
Yeah, to add on to that, Alex, with Purdy in the red zone, he's been stellar since he took over in week 13 for this 49ers offense. He's fourth in IQR, tied for fifth in positive pass percentage, and he's also second in on-target percentage and fourth in completion percentage. So he's been accurate in getting the job done there. However, the 49ers are second to last in the playoff rankings among teams in the red zone. And what's been super interesting with that is it's because of the run game. Christian McCaffrey's struggled, actually, inside of the red zone when it comes to running the ball. He's good for this year. He's been -3 in rushing, has -3 rushing total points over the time span when Purdy took over in week 13, which ranks 156 out of 166 players who had a carry since that time. So outside of the red zone, he ranks fifth in total points. So I don't know what's going on there inside the red zone there with McCaffrey running the ball, but certainly an interesting dichotomy and kind of not really intuitive from what you would think of what a 49ers offense looks like.
Yeah, that's a funny one. But yeah, and to your point about what a 49ers offense looks like, this is a very unique offense. The guys that they put in all kinds of different positions, players who can catch the ball, run the ball, whatever. And so you would expect a team like that can use a lot of different alignments and move people around pre-snap and that sort of thing to be pretty successful in the red zone, because they can do all kinds of things and you can't really focus on one aspect.
Yeah, one thing that I'm looking forward to seeing how he's deployed is Micah Parsons in this game. I know throughout most of the year, for example, in the All-Pro balloting, he'd be an edge this year, not a linebacker, based on all of the snaps that he's had really as a down lineman. And I actually think he's sort of worn down a bit as the year's gone on, maybe as a result of that switch. What we saw, though, last week was him playing back off the ball a little bit more, including spending more time in coverage than I would care for. However, I am intrigued by the idea of him sort of moving around. Like, you have all these athletes that the Niners can deploy in all these fun different ways that sort of make your defense have to adjust to it. Well, when you got Micah Parsons, I like making the offense adjust to him. Like, I love when he's like roaming around and you don't know which gap he's going to rush through, and he can just throw a wrench into anything that you do at any given time, because he's just that much of a sort of wild card type player and just so difficult to account for. So to me, when I look at, okay, how do the Cowboys sort of counter all these different players that the Niners have that they can deploy in all these different ways? I think it's getting Micah Parsons into Brock Purdy's face and having him come in as many different directions to bother him as possible. Because, I think once it becomes a drop back game, once we get out of 1st and 10, 2nd and 4, this sort of stuff, and now we have 3rd and 10 here, then I think it's advantage Cowboys as far as when the Niners have the ball in this game. The hard part is getting into those situations in the first place, because the Niners are so good at playing that sort of CFL style 2 downs and another first down type of football. So that's the one part that I really keep an eye on is when the Niners have the ball, where is Parsons being deployed? And maybe they've sort of been saving him for a playoff run. I'd like to think so.
I also think it'll be interesting to see having Trayvon Diggs and his sort of like lack of physicality in the way that he plays after the catch is a pretty bad matchup against a 49ers team that is excellent after the catch. So that'll be kind of interesting to see if he's mixing it up at all, or if he's potentially okay with allowing some yak there.
Very exciting game over there. I'm looking forward to the CeeDee Lamb show. I'm looking forward to the Deebo Samuel show. It should be a good time. Like you said, James, this is really good offenses against really good defenses. And when you look at across the total points categories, these teams are 2 of the best in the league. So Sunday should be a lot of fun. On that note, we will sign off and get out of here. For our producer, Justin Stein, and James Weaver and Alex Vigderman, I'm Matt Manocherian, and thank you for listening to the SIS Off the Charts Football Podcast.